Hi guys, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new, hi, I'm Taylor and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am going to be comparing the e.l.f. Bite Size eyeshadow palette in Cream and Sugar to the Wet n Wild Coloricon palette in Walking on Eggshells. I did this eyeshadow look with this palette and this eyeshadow look with this palette. As you guys can see, they're pretty close to the same eyeshadow look. Both these palettes are really close in the same shades. Before we start the video, don't forget to hit that like button down below and subscribe to my channel because I would love to have you. Also, make sure you have your post notifications turned on so you don't miss an upload, and let's start the video. So this is the Wet n Wild Coloricon palette and the e.l.f. Bite Size eyeshadow palette. The Bite Size eyeshadow palette has 4 shadows, 2 mattes and 2 shimmers, and the Wet n Wild Coloricon palette has 4 different shadows, 2 shimmers, and 3 matte shades. As you guys can tell that they are very, very close in the same shades. Some of them are exactly the same shade, I would say. So I'm going to be doing some swatches and showing you guys up close how close these palettes are together and the shades, and just comparing these palettes on what I think is better, the Wet n Wild eyeshadow palette or the e.l.f. eyeshadow palette. So they both have that dark brown shade, and that's pretty much the same exact shade. Then there is a lighter, more copper shimmer shadow, and definitely in the Wet n Wild palette it is a little bit darker, but it definitely is the same. And then we have a more pink eyeshadow shimmer in the Wet n Wild, and then more of a cream white shimmer in the e.l.f. And then we have a light tan in both of them, and definitely the e.l.f. Is a lot lighter, and the Wet n Wild is more of a beige color. And then the other shade in the Wet n Wild palette is more of a white matte shadow, but it does have some shimmer in it. So my camera cut off, so I didn't get that video of that being swatched, but that is the dark brown eyeshadow in the Elfcosmetics Bite Size palette. And I'm just going to be swatching the same shadow in the Wet n Wild palette next, and having them right next to each other to compare the shadows. And as you guys can tell, they are pretty much the same exact shadow. And now when we're talking about the formula, I definitely think the Wet n Wild formula is a lot more chalky. There's a lot more like fallout and powder than the e.l.f. Cosmetics formula. And now I'm just going to swatch the shimmer, and that is more of a copper gold shimmer, I would say. And in the e.l.f. palette, it is so creamy. It is like super easy to put, it like glides on, it's so creamy. And then we have the same shade in the Wet n Wild palette, and that is a little bit darker of a copper color. It's like the same shadow, but this one is a little bit darker. And something I did notice is that the shimmer eyeshadow is not as creamy as the e.l.f. Cosmetics. It is a little bit more powdery. Now we have the next shimmer shadow, and that is 2 totally different colors, I know. In the Wet n Wild palette, it is more of a rose gold pink shimmer, and in the e.l.f. it is more of a white cream eyeshadow. And that is, you guys can tell, that is super pigmented, and it is so creamy in the e.l.f. palette. So I definitely would say that the shimmer eyeshadows in the e.l.f. palette are way more creamy and pigmented than in the Wet n Wild palette. The Wet n Wild is just not as creamy as the e.l.f. shimmers. You guys can see that those e.l.f. shimmers are so pigmented, and then the Wet n Wild ones not so much. Like looking at the swatches, honestly, that copper shimmer in the Wet n Wild palette kind of looks like a matte shade. You're not really seeing it's like glistening or anything. And now I'm just going to be swatching the two tan colors, and in the Wet n Wild palette is more of a beige color, and in the Elf palette it's more of like a skin tone color. So these eyeshadow palettes are super close in the same shades. Some of the shades are a little bit different, but pretty much they're exactly the same. Kind of the same concept, a small palette. The Wet n Wild just has one more shade. It's about around the same price. I said before, the Wet n Wild is $2.99 at Walmart and Target, but $3.99 on the Wet n Wild website, and then the Elf is $3. So now I'm just going to start creating a similar look using those two shadows. I'm going to be using one palette for one eye and the other palette for the other eye, and create as close to the same look as I can and test these out on my eyes and give you guys my comparison of the two. So I'm just going to start by priming my eyelids like I always do. I'm using Elf concealer, and I'm just going to be priming my eyelids, and then I will be blotting that in and blending it so that the concealer is a little bit tacky, so the eyeshadow sticks better and blends better. So for the first eye, I'm going to be using that Elf Cosmetics Bite Size palette, and I'm going to be using that darkest shade in the palette, and I'm going to be blending that into the corner of my eye and dragging it all along the crease of my eye. I am going to stay a little bit back from the inner corner of my eye just because I don't want it to be too dark in the inner corner, and I'm just going to be blending that out. I've used this palette quite a bit before, and it definitely is pigmented, and it blends out really well, so I'm interested to see how the Wet n Wild one is compared to this one. So I'm just going to be blending that all out in back and forth in circular motions. I do think that this darker shadow in the Elf palette is a little bit darker than the Wet n Wild. But now I'm just going to be going in with that light tan color, and I'm going to be blending that out. I'm using a fluffy blending brush, and I'm just going to be going in those back and forth circular motions to blend that out and blend those two shades together so there's no harsh line. As you guys can tell that this eyeshadow is super light, this beige color. It's super light, and it is definitely harder to blend out because it is so light and the brown is so dark. But it definitely does blend out. It just takes maybe a little bit longer. Like I said, I've used this palette before, and it does blend super good. Now I am just going to be going back in with that dark shadow and doing my lower lash line. I'm going to be applying that dark brown as close to my waterline as possible, and I'm going to be using a defining brush to do that. So I'm just going to be doing that, and now I'm just going to be taking that light tan color and blending that out of my lower lash line, and then I'm going to be going in with the shimmer, and I'm going to be using that white creamish color shimmer, and it is super pigmented and super creamy. It goes on really well. I didn't have to wet my brush, and this is how pigmented it is. I really love these shimmer shadows in the Elf palette. They're like great. They're really high quality, just as high quality as some higher end brands, so I really like that. Now I'm going to be going on to my other Wet n Wild palette, and I'm going to be doing my other eye, and I'm going to be doing the same exact look just with this palette. So I'm taking that dark brown shade, and I'm going to be blending that into my outer corner and all along the crease of my eye, just like I did with the Elf shadow. And you guys can definitely tell that it is super similar to the same dark brown. I do think the Elf is a little bit darker, and also something I noticed is I'm having to use a little bit more of the eyeshadow for this Wet n Wild to get that pigment the same as the Elf. So you do have to use more, and like I said, the Wet n Wild is more chalky eyeshadow, like there is fallout. So now I'm going to be going in and using that beige color, and I'm going to be using a fluffy blending brush to do that, and I'm just going to be blending those two shadows out like I did my other eye. And definitely this one is going to look a little bit different because this tan is a lot darker than the elf tan. So I'm just going to be blending that out. And something I did notice right off the bat was that it is going to take a lot to blend this out. These shadows are not blending out as well as the elf shadows. It is taking a lot more, and like I said, the shadows are a lot more chalky, so there's a lot of fallout and not a lot of payoff. Like when I'm blending it, it's kind of just going everywhere and not really sticking to my eye. So I'm just going to be using those same two shades to do my lower lash line, and I'm taking that dark shade right now and blending it all across my waterline. And something I did notice is it's not as pigmented when I'm blending it on my waterline as it was when I was blending it on my eyelid, and I definitely think that's because the primer, the concealer definitely made it more pigmented. So now I'm just going to be taking that pink shimmer and applying it all over my eyelid like I did to my other eye. And yeah, this shimmer is more pink and the other one was more white, so I probably should have compared the other two copper shimmers because they were more similar, but I decided to go with this because I don't know. So I basically got the same look. There is just a few minor differences, but overall both looks are really pretty. They turned out really good, but I do think that the e.l.f. palette, the formula, I just like the formula of the e.l.f. eyeshadow better. It was easier to blend, more pigmented and stuff, but the Wet n Wild palette was still a great palette. I just would prefer the formula of the e.l.f. palette. Alright guys, that is all I have for you in today's video. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button down below and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.